OJK memiliki visi dan komitmen yang kuat dalam pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan secara berkelanjutan, guna mendukung terwujudnya industri jasa keuangan yang stabil, kontributif, dan inklusif. Kami sadar, dalam mewujudkan visi tersebut, peran SDM yang unggul dan kompeten menjadi kunci utama. OJK Institute hadir untuk menjadi Center of Excellence, guna mendukung pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan dan melakukan riset-riset yang inovatif dan terkini. Pengembangan sumber daya manusia sektor jasa keuangan yang kompeten dan profesional menjadi salah satu faktor penting dalam mendukung keberhasilan kinerja lembaga jasa keuangan. OJK Institute memiliki 3 fungsi utama. 1. Mengembangkan kapasitas SDM sektor jasa keuangan melalui penyelenggaraan program pelatihan, seminar, dan workshop. 2. Melakukan riset yang inovatif dan visioner. 3. Merancang dan mengembangkan standar kompetensi SDM sektor jasa keuangan, serta melakukan penata laksanaan lembaga sertifikasi profesi. Dalam rangka meningkatkan kompetensi SDM di sektor jasa keuangan, OJK Institute menyelenggarakan berbagai program capacity building, baik dalam bentuk workshop ataupun webinar. Menghadirkan narasumber terbaik yang memiliki keahlian di bidangnya, antara lain bidang perbankan, pasar modal, IKNB, teknologi digital, dan lain-lain. Riset di OJK Institute berbasis akademik dengan memperhatikan perkembangan terkini. Penyusunan riset menghasilkan temuan dan rekomendasi yang mendukung kinerja sektor jasa keuangan. OJK Institute juga menyediakan perpustakaan digital e-library OJK yang mengelola koleksi buku digital, koleksi internal OJK, koleksi buku fisik, dan koleksi e-resources mitra OJK. Selain itu, manfaatkan juga aplikasi e-lib OJK untuk membaca e-book melalui smartphone. Minisite OJK Institute tersedia sebagai portal media digital untuk mempermudah publik mengakses berbagai informasi kegiatan OJK Institute terkini. Selain itu, OJK Institute juga membangun knowledge management system sebagai media pembelajaran dan pertukaran knowledge secara digital yang dapat diakses oleh seluruh SDM sektor jasa keuangan. Indonesia saat ini telah menerapkan strategi pengembangan SDM berbasis kompetensi. OJK Institute bekerja sama dengan instansi-instansi terkait dalam menyusun suatu standarisasi kompetensi yang disebut dengan SKKNI, yang kemudian diturunkan menjadi KKNI. SKKNI dan KKNI dimaksud digunakan oleh lembaga sertifikasi profesi atau LSP dalam penyusunan skema sertifikasi, pengajuan rekomendasi, dan pengajuan pendaftaran ke OJK. Selain 3 fungsi utama tersebut, OJK Institute juga berfungsi sebagai license officer, praktek kerja lapangan, visit OJK, penelitian mahasiswa. OJK Institute memfasilitasi program praktek kerja lapangan di lingkungan OJK bagi pelajar dan mahasiswa. OJK Institute juga menerima kunjungan lembaga pendidikan yang ingin memperluas wawasan bidang tugas dan fungsi OJK serta sektor jasa keuangan. Selain itu, OJK Institute senantiasa memfasilitasi mahasiswa dalam hal penyediaan data atau informasi terkait dengan tugas dan fungsi OJK. Dalam rangka mendukung pengembangan SDM sektor jasa keuangan, OJK telah menerbitkan Cetak Biru Pengembangan Sumber Daya Manusia Sektor Jasa Keuangan 2021-2025 pada 25 Mei 2021. Cetak Biru tersebut memiliki visi yaitu mewujudkan SDM sektor jasa keuangan yang profesional, berintegritas, dan berdaya saing global dalam rangka meningkatkan kinerja sektor jasa keuangan. Visi tersebut dijabarkan dalam 4 pilar misi, yaitu 1. Mengembangkan standarisasi kompetensi SDM. 2. Mengembangkan metode peningkatan kompetensi SDM. 3. Mengembangkan infrastruktur pendukung pengembangan SDM. 4. Mengembangkan SDM yang memiliki kompetensi digital. Implementasi cetak biru ini kemudian dituangkan ke dalam 21 program kerja yang akan dilakukan dalam kurun waktu 5 tahun dengan melibatkan peran aktif dari industri, akademisi, OJK, dan lembaga lainnya. OJK Institute memiliki komitmen yang kuat untuk melaksanakan cetak biru tersebut bersama-sama dengan pengawas, industri, akademisi, dan pemangku kepentingan lainnya. Cetak biru tersebut diharapkan menjadi kerangka acuan dalam mendukung pengembangan SDM sektor jasa keuangan. OJK Institute, Center of Excellence.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin this event, allow me to inform you several guidelines during this event. You may type your questions via the Q&A feature by mentioning your name, institution, and the name of the speaker to whom you address your questions. And all the questions can be submitted in English or Bahasa. And yes, this event will be conducted in English. We provide an interpreter feature. Please choose the language that you're most comfortable with. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy our discussions. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon us all. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Honorable Head of OJK Institute, Bapak Agus Sugiarto, Director Financial Services Sector Development, Bapak Hikmah Rinaldi, Executive Senior Analyst of OJK Institute, Ibu Ninyoman Puspani, our speaker, Mr. Paul Donovan, our book reviewers, Professor Insukindro and Bapak Sahminan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the book review event we titled The Truth About Inflation, a Simple Guide for Businesses to Make Better Investment Decisions by Paul Donovan. Bapak, Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, currently there are 786 people who join this book review. The majority comes from the banking sector with 52% of the majority. The non-bank financial industry, 19%, academics, 7%, the government institutions, 5%, and the capital market sector, 5%, OJK, 4%, and others, 8%. We really wish that you will enjoy our discussion, and this discussion will be beneficial and fruitful for all of us. And before we begin, allow me to inform you the sequence of today's agenda. This event will be started with opening remarks by the head of OJK Institute, followed by presentation and discussions led by the moderator, and continue to question and answer session, and we will end this event with closing remarks. All right, without any further delay, we are now opening today's event with the welcoming remarks by the head of OJK Institute. Please welcome Bapak Agus Sugiarto.
Terima kasih, Mas Aldi. Good morning, Mr. Paul Donovan. Thanks for your time from London, UK. Selamat siang untuk Bapak Sahminan, Direktur Kebijakan Moneter, Direktur Kebijakan Ekonomi dan Moneter Bank Indonesia. Dan selamat datang juga kepada sahabat kami, Profesor Dr. Insukindro, Guru Besar Fakultas Ekonomi dan Bisnis dari Universitas Indonesia. Bapak Ibu sekalian yang mengikuti acara bedah buku ini yang berada di seluruh Indonesia dari ujung barat sampai ujung timur, selamat siang dan terima kasih atas waktunya. Bapak Ibu segenap pimpinan lembaga jasa keuangan dari komisaris, direksi, pejabat-pejabat lainnya dan juga para pejabat maupun pegawai dari OJK yang ada di kantor pusat maupun daerah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, ladies and gentlemen, we are very thank you today to have the Truth About Inflation book review because today the inflation topic is very happening. The book that we will review this time is very fascinating and relevant to the problem of business practitioners, especially those who work in the financial sectors as the participant attending today. Before we start the discussion about this book, The Truth About Inflation, please allow me to say some points. In the current economic development, inflation is very relevant issue to be discussed today. Inflation is an economic phenomenon that has attracted the attention of various parties, from the public to businesses, because of its considerable influence on the country economy. For the public, inflation is a concern, very concern for the public, because it directly affects welfare, affect their wages. High inflation will cause people their income to fall, reducing welfare. And for businesses, inflation is an important factor in making decisions on production factor. Unstable inflation will create uncertainty for businesses in making decisions. If we look at in the financial sector today, inflation is not only engaged on some aspect of the financial sector, such as on the lending capacity, stock market return, and also on insurance portfolio. But also it will affect the demand of bank loan, also financing provided by the financial sector. We also point out that businesses often fail to understand inflation proportionally because they cannot correctly calculating its impact on investment, and therefore this failure will impact their accuracy in making investment decisions and consequently may lead to unprofitable investment. To understand the behavior on inflation is very essential for businesses, especially with the financial sector, to make better decisions. Considering the inflation rate before concluding an investment will help companies as well as financial sector to maintain the rate of return. Selecting investment will potentially generate higher return than the inflation rate is necessary. Again, the financial services industry, as a profit-oriented institution, also need to understand why the behavior of inflation sometimes cannot be predictable. Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, participant, speakers, and gentlemen, this book about the truth about inflation is very interesting to be discussed today, because with the author attending and speaking for this session today, will add and broaden our experiences and also knowledge about the inflation, why they come in, who will suffer about inflation, and how to implement a good strategy. Of course, in this discussion today, we also have two other speakers. One from the policymaker from Bank Indonesia, the Central Bank of Indonesia, Bapak Sahminan. He will discuss and also explain to us the strategy of Bank Indonesia, how to cope with inflation, and also from the academic background, from the academic perspective, Professor Insukindro will also discuss the theory of the inflation and how we beat inflation in this current situation. Everybody knows today that the inflation rate now is very accelerating in almost any Western countries, in almost any developed countries. We look at in the United States, North America, even in Latin America, most countries in the European Union, in some Asian countries, and also Australia, they jump very high. And I agree with the discussion before we start this discussion today with Mr. Paul Donovan, that those inflation is mostly caused by the profit motive rather than the increase of the wages. Again, I would like to say thank you to the main speaker, Mr. Paul Donovan, for your time in London. Terima kasih juga kepada Bapak Sahminan. Dan terima kasih juga kepada Profesor Insukindro yang sudah hadir. Dan juga terima kasih kepada pembawa acara dan juga sekaligus moderator Mas Aldi Hawari. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Semoga acara bedah buku pada siang ini bisa memberikan manfaat yang sebenarnya buat kita semuanya, khususnya buat Bapak Ibu yang menjadi decision maker di lembaga jasa keuangan, baik itu di perbankan, di pasar modal, maupun di industri keuangan bank. Sekali lagi kami ucapkan terima kasih, selamat siang, dan selamat mendengarkan dan berdiskusi dalam acara bedah buku ini. Terima kasih juga kepada Ibu Komang dan teman-teman dari OJK Institute yang sudah membuat acara ini berlangsung, yang sudah direncanakan dari awal. Tentunya kami juga memberikan apresiasi. Sekali lagi terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Pak Agus Sugiarto, for your very insightful and also warm remarks and keynotes that you just addressed. If I may conclude your remarks, you stated that this book is very fascinating and relevant to whom working at financial sector. You also addressed that high inflation, unstable inflation can create uncertainties in businesses. And this inflation thing doesn't only engage with financial sector, but also the demand of bank loan and also financing that provided on financial sector. Thus, businesses often fail to understand about the inflation correctly, and this can be causing failure that affect investment decisions. Yes, Pak Agus, we really wish that this event will bring out new perspectives of understanding macroeconomies, especially towards inflation. Once again, thank you very much, Pak Agus Sugiarto. Please give applause. All right, Bapak Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we have come to the first book reviewer. We have Professor Insukindro joining with us from Universitas Gadjah Mada, and allow me to present him with his short biography. Prof. Insukindro, he is a professor from Universitas Gadjah Mada who has solid experiences in financial industries and education. He is a faculty member, expert panelist, and consultant on BI Institute since 2015. He also joining expert panel and speaker for Research Evaluation OJK since 2015, and lecturer at national and international universities. He obtained his PhD in economics from University of Essex, UK, got his master degree at Katholieke University Leuven, Belgium, and his Bachelor of Economics degree from Universitas Gadjah Mada. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on screen Professor Insukindro. Professor, hello, how are you, Professor?
Fine.
Yeah,
okay.
Professor, before we start, maybe a short question. How do we need to understand the current situation around the world, especially towards the inflation? We see that the developed countries, emerging countries, we have uneven inflation and also uneven economic growth. How does the situation affecting nations, especially Indonesia?
This is situation in the world, not only in Indonesia. You see that the war between Russia and Ukraine is also imposed this kind of inflation because of the increase of oil, especially, and also shock in the supply side economics.
Okay. Do you see that this book can answer or deliver the solution from the inflation that nowadays happening around the world and causing such a turbulence on economics?
This book is written in 2015, and the situation is different now.
Okay.
The concept maybe is okay, but to solve the problem is different thing, I think.
All right. So without any further ado, please, Prof, you may have the screen and deliver your review about this book, The Truth About Inflation.
Okay, I will share my short. Okay. Okay, this is my short review, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome the opportunity given to me to participate in this book review event organized by OJK Institute. It is especially very nice for me to be able to meet Honorable Mr. Paul Donovan, the author of The Truth About Inflation. In the beginning of my review, I will talking about inflation. He is always interested in economic analysis because inflation describes the percentage increase in the average level of prices from one year to the next. And it is one of the important indicators that can provide important information about dynamic movement of prices for goods and services. The average level of prices is usually referred to the price of level proxy by consumer price index. And this price index also discussed very briefly by Paul Donovan, I think. And inflation measure using by this price is also called CPI inflation or headline inflation, which is a composite of core, administered price, and total goods inflation. And we're also familiar with the concept of quarterly inflation, YOY, year on year, or QT to Q or P to P, and but this is sometimes it's not easy to understand between these two, especially for the regular people or investor and also businessmen. What is it? Quarterly inflation, Y to Y, Y on Y, or year on year, and point to point. The dynamic movement have a direct impact on the level of purchasing power and cost of living, changes in the value of assets and liabilities, as well as the value of contract or business transaction. Inflation can be used as a set of basic information for decision-making process at the micro or macro level, and for fiscal and monetary policy. At the micro level, household, for example, can use the inflation rate as a basis for adjusting their daily expenditures with their relative fixed income. At the corporate or investor level, inflation rate can be used for spending planning and business contract. In the macro level, inflation rate describes the condition or stability of monetary and economy. Inflation is also closely related to changes in interest rate, and it is important for Bank Indonesia, for example, because they know about the Bank Indonesia reaction function. Economic productivity, foreign exchange rates, budget indexation, stagflation, and we just discussed in the earlier of our meeting, what is it? Stagflation. Stagflation is combination between higher inflation and recession, especially recession because of supply side shock and other macroeconomic parameters. Specifically, the uses of inflation, among others, are for wage indexation, contractual payment, project escalation, inflation targeting, budget indexation, GDP deflator, living cost, early indicator of interest rate, stock price index, and belief curve. It's a very famous concept in economics. And also central bank reaction function. This is important also, central bank reaction function, because based on this function, we know that there is, we have positive relationship between interest rate and inflation. If inflation increase or expected inflation increase, and then monetary authority will increase interest rate. So in general, inflation is simple and very familiar topic. Its basic concept is expected to be easy for everyone to understand. However, in this book, The Truth About Inflation, Mr. Paul Donovan argued that business agents or investors often fail to understand the behavior of inflation, especially in measuring or computing and predicting its impacts on investment decisions and business contracts. The purpose of his book is not to provide a tool or mathematical economic or econometric model of forecasting inflation, but to provide a means for understanding inflation. Understanding what inflation is and what it is not is something that is increasingly missing from investment decisions. A proper understanding of why inflation cannot and should not be reduced to a single number will prevent investors from making potentially damaging decisions. In this book, inflation is examined or investigated from global and urban perspective around the world, and aim to make the topic of inflation less confusing to business actors and investors of all backgrounds. From the beginning of his book, Mr. Donovan stated that inflation is not a simple topic. Therefore, reducing it to a simple statement or format or formula will cause the calculation or prediction of inflation to be inaccurate for modern investors. This book explains the truth of the matter related, among others, to first headline or CPI inflation. This inflation usually published yearly, quarterly, or monthly by government, but it is not the best accurate number that potential investor or business consultant can use to estimate inflation. In order for a price to meet the main requirement of measuring inflation, the price used is both base one and meet the economic concept and criteria. This is because the latter price has a real impact on consumers and business actors and investors. Second, uncertainty. As mentioned above, inflation is measured and forecasted by using an economic formula or model that is built based on the assumption of certainty. In the real world, behavior of the consumer and business actor are faced with uncertainty. Therefore, predicted inflation often said to be statistically economic fraud. Finally, perception of consumer and investor or business actors about inflation. Their perception is often inaccurate or wrong and is influenced by their expenditure. If consumers misinterpret inflation and the direction of its movement, all of this is also affect the behavior of investor business actor in assessing inflation. It is hoped that this book will help its readers understand the realities of inflation and provide the necessary set of tools and framework to think about inflation and protect themselves against its current and future movement up and down. Finally, I hope that Mr. Donovan will soon be able to publish the new edition of this interesting book. And also, I also recommend the audience, especially investors or who work in the financial sector in this event to own and read this book. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Insukindro, for your very, mind-provoking, enlightening review. And with all your insightful perspective, you must be one of the highly anticipated reviewer of this book, indeed. And if I may summarize your review, I quote that you said the purpose of this book is not to provide tools or a mathematical, economical, or an econometric model of forecasting inflation, but to provide a means of understanding inflation. This book aims to make the topic of inflation less confusing to businesses, actors, and investors of all background. And you really recommend this book to all investors and also financial business sector. Thank you very much, Professor Insukindro, for your review. Bapak, Ibu, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to our second book reviewer, Bapak Sahminan. He is Director, Economic and Monetary Policy Department of Bank Indonesia. Allow me to read his brief introduction first. Bapak Sahminan, in his current position, he is the Director, Economics and Monetary Policy Department of Bank Indonesia. He is also the Director or Senior Principal Economist. Prior to this position, he was one of the Deputy Director of Bank Indonesia. He also worked at ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, or AMRO, Singapore, from 2012 to 2014. He obtained his PhD in economics in 2005 from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, USA, master degree in applied economics from University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, USA, got bachelor degree from IPB University in statistics with honors in 1992. Please welcome Mr. Sahminan. Hello.
Hello,
Sahminan, how are you?
Very good. Thank you, Pak Aldi, for the introduction.
Yeah, I guess you really have a very, work to do to, counter the inflation that really happen now, not only in the world, especially in Indonesia, that we really see the price goes up, and also the, people really cannot afford the price hikes. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that while inflation is increasing, but so far still within the target. You know that currently
still on the
inflation
range, right?
target in Indonesia still is 3 plus -1, meaning that between 2 and 4%. So that's what we've seen now so far. Yeah.
How important it is, the inflation, for central bank to determine, the BI rates, the central bank rates?
As you know that Bank Indonesia in managing macroeconomic stability uses a number of policies, a number of instruments, what we call a policy mix. So interest rate is one of the policy instruments, but other than that, we also use intervention in foreign exchange market, even in government bond market, and also we use also liquidity as instruments to manage the liquidity of the economy. So interest rate is only one of the instruments, and which one to use, of course, that it depends on our analysis and our reading on the economy comprehensively. That's what we usually do in Bank Indonesia. Yeah, I think that
yes. So far,
today,
our government
today, I think the decisions on the policy, monthly policy, maybe it's already announced, because usually it's announced at 2 p.m. But I haven't looked at the news because I've joined this Zoom.
Yeah. And maybe we have to be proud to our nation, because we got many credit for the global countries, because we can control or manage our inflation and our economic growth still on the range, on the controllable level. All right, Mr. Sahminan, we're really longing for your book review that's about inflation. So over to you.
All right, thank you, Aldi. Yang saya hormati Pak Agus Sugiarto, pimpinan OJK Institute, rekan-rekan OJK, rekan-rekan perbankan, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the OJK Institute, of course, for inviting me to this event. And it is an honor for me also to have an opportunity to review the book by Paul Donovan titled The Truth About Inflation. I think the event today is quite timely, as the global economy is now facing an increasing and in many countries already high inflation. And in fact, high inflation is one of the key risks to the global economy this year. If we look at the IMF publication, for example, the latest World Economic Outlook published in April 2022, it projected that the global inflation this year would increase to 6.8%. This is more than twice the inflation rate in 2020, which was only 2.8%. The elevated inflation rates are not only seen in emerging and developing economies, as it used to be, at least in the past few decades, but the high inflation rate is now being experienced by advanced economies. I'm sure that many of colleagues here pay attention to how high inflation rate in the US now. And also, like Paul said earlier, that even in the UK, inflation rate now reached, I think, more than 8%, which say maybe last year or 2 or 3 years ago, developed economies, Western European economies, the US, were more on the fear of deflation rather than inflation. But now the condition reversed. What we are concerned now and what other countries concerned now are inflation. Now, what about Indonesia? In Indonesia, as I think also as mentioned by Pak Aldi before that, although inflation remains well under control, but we have also seen that inflation has started to increase. Last year, we know that inflation rate in Indonesia even a bit below target, which was only 1.87%. But now, at least according to the IMF prediction, that this year inflation in Indonesia may reach to 3.98%. And as we followed the news from Indonesian Statistics Office last month, that inflation in April was 3.47%. So like we have talked about earlier, that we've seen also increasing inflation rate in Indonesia. Now, let me talk about at least what I have read from Paul Donovan book. The book, I believe that the book will help us to better understand inflation. That's one of the main thing that I can say. One thing, it provides an excellent explanation on inflation, which is quite different from the way Donovan approached his explanations. Usually, when we're talking about inflation, especially when we took macroeconomic class in college, that the first thing that we will learn maybe some equations of inflation. But this book is quite different, which is there is no mathematical equations. I mean, if there is one equations, although like Paul also said that this Satchul's identity is this money, what do you call it? Money equation, MV equals to P times Q. That's the only, I mean, if we can say that it is an equation, although it's just an identity. And the first question that the book tries to explain is what actually inflation means. As I think that we have heard that Professor Insukindo also explained from conceptual thinking of what inflation is. In his book, Paul also said that actually that inflation, an increase in one commodity doesn't mean inflation. So what inflation means is that the general increase in prices of goods and services. That's one thing that we have to keep in mind. So the fact that, for example, there is an increase in cooking oil, it doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily mean there is an inflation. But when the broad-based prices of goods and services increase, that's what we call by inflation, which is clearly pointed out by Paul Donovan in his book. While, of course, this might not new for us who have already taken, at least the ones who have already taken macroeconomic class. But I think that the way Paul explains this concept help reader better understand inflation even with very limited economic knowledge. Now, the second question is that the interest of these books is that or at least that this books explains is why is understanding inflation so important for us? Either we are as a consumer or as an investor, or maybe, of course, that I mean, as a policymaker. Otherwise, I mean, maybe there's no central bank if there's no inflation. But but the one that focus of this book is that why is inflation so important for us as consumers and as investors, particularly, and what does inflation mean for consumers and investors? As Paul argues, inflation data accurately capture and aggregate measures of the change in the cost of living, but not the cost of living of any individual investor or any individual consumer. And therefore, for consumers, higher inflation means higher living costs. And if income doesn't increase, at least the same as the inflation rate, the consumers would be worse off. For investors, higher inflation means a lower real return on their assets. So, I mean, if I'm sure that I believe that many of us here, to some extent, are investors, whereas investors in a stock market or in government bonds or in property. This condition would lower consumption. You know, when there's inflation, while our income is the same, this will lead to lower our consumption. I mean, other things being equal. Of course, if we can borrow money, it means that we can still catch up our spending, but at the cost of future consumption. Meaning that if we borrow money now and if we don't have any increase in income, of course, we have to reduce our consumption in the future. It means that higher inflation, meaning that investment may less attractive and lower economic growth. Nonetheless, as Paul argues in his book, that inflation sets out to determine the average cost of living, but not to determine an individual experience of the cost of living. This is one of the interesting things about this book. Usually that if we read a book on inflation, especially in macroeconomic books, and also that if, say, the analysts usually that use pretty much the inflation as an average cost of living, meaning that the same inflation that faced by all population, at least in certain country. But it doesn't mean that, say, for example, if inflation increased 3%, it doesn't mean that the inflation I face, the same with the inflation faced by, say, a construction worker, or maybe it doesn't also the same with inflation rate faced by taxi drivers. Because of what? Because we have different consumption baskets. But maybe between me and colleague from OJK, the fact that we do very much the same things, and I'm sure so we consume very much similar things. So to some extent, we have more similar consumption baskets. So it means that we have more similar kind of inflation that affect our consumption directly. So this is the one thing that one of the interesting that explained well in this book. There is inequality in inflation. So therefore, if we want to look at the impact of inflation on a certain group of consumers and investors, we have to look at more granular data on inflation rather than aggregate inflation. I think this is also quite true for because I'm talking in OJK Institute, that I'm sure that many of the participants here are our colleagues from OJK. So, I mean, if we are looking at the, say, the growth of consumption credit, that I think in this case also we can look at more granular inflation's impacts on the consumers' credit based on their maybe income category, or depends on their job or positions. So as shown in this book, that one of the clear pictures provided by Paul in this book is that over the past 3 decades, at least, that inflation for lower income population has risen faster than inflation for high income populations. So it is very clear that here inflation faced by different group of people also can be quite different, even for a long period of time. So investment strategies will need to be devised in this case, as proposed by Paul, will need to be devised that at least come close to mimicking the specific cost of the future standard of living. Now, given the importance of understanding inflation, Donovan provides good explanation of what drives inflation. Again, like I said, that without using behavioral equations, without using econometrics, this and that, he explained very well in an easy to digest and to understand what drives inflation. His arguments on what drives inflation are not only supported by a certain country's experience in recent decades or in recent years, but also by the history of inflation since ancient times. Well, it's quite amazing to me, because many of the story that I, as an economist, also I didn't know that before. I mean, to that detail and to that long period of history. Based on the history, inflation can be, I mean, as explained in this book, inflation can be driven by at least 3 factors. That is, a surge in demand that the economy is unable to meet, a contraction in economic supply against unchanged demand, or an excessive increase of the money supply. Of course, this is, I think this is just sort of like the category that we can put inside of either of the 3 of these, because otherwise someone might ask that, well, what about labor costs? Because especially now what happened in developed countries, at least say by the IMF, for example, at least in the US, that I mean, I know that one of the sources of inflation is recently is the increases in labor costs. I mean, this is at least that is one of the drive of inflation. But I think that it's really true. I couldn't agree more that inflation is driven by these three factors. That's also what we're observing now. Like what Paul said in this book is that one of the common perceptions of the relationship between inflation and money is that printing money creates inflation, which I totally agree with this misperception, because that it is not printing money that creates inflations, but instead it is printing too much money. So that's the one that creates inflation. Meaning what? If central bank prints money in line with the increase in the economic activity and in line with the increase in money demand, so it means it won't create inflation. But of course, if a central bank prints a lot of money, too much money, while demand for money is quite low, so that one creates inflation. Like, of course, the challenge is that for we economists and for central banks is that, like also pointed out by Paul in his book, is that there's no magic indicator for money demand. Well, we can use different kind of methodology to estimate money demand. We can use different kind of econometric equations, but there is no such clear, crystal clear way to pin down the exact money demand. Of course, we can just estimate, but what exactly, to what extent is that exactly? It is still with uncertainty, of course.
Right. So, Sahminan, I would like to kindly remind you that you have only 2 minutes left to end your presentation. Thank you.
Another misconception surrounding inflation that's pointed out in this book is that perceived relationship between debt and inflation. According to this book, the idea that inflation automatically reduces the burden is a myth. Well, it is true. I agree that it is true that a higher inflation may increase GDP and then lower debt to GDP ratio. But we have to remember that higher inflation, meaning that investor will ask higher return on, say, if they invest in government bonds. So it's not also good for government to have a higher inflation. I mean, at least it's also one simple way to say it. Another thing that I would like to point out is that the role of foreigners in driving inflation. So I think this is quite relevant to understand what is going on currently. Like what explained in this book is that at least there are 3 channels to which foreigners may affect domestic inflation. The first one is exporting monetary policy, and then second one is global supply and demand, and the third one is exchange rate policy and trade. So in this case, I quite agree with this book. But the one thing that maybe that not quite sure, maybe Paul Donovan will explain that further. That he said that foreign monetary policy affect domestic inflation is actually just from risk appetite. But I think that there is other channels that foreign monetary policy that may affect inflation, domestic inflation. I think about that. Just like when the U.S. increase or raise policy rate or tighten its monetary policy, and then there's capital flows from emerging markets, and then that leads to depreciation in the exchange rate. And then we have to remember that emerging markets and developing economies in general, exchange rate pass through to inflation, although it has declined over the past few decades, but it's still, to some extent, there is still exchange rate pass through of exchange rate into inflation. That's true. I mean, for exporting to the U.S., particularly, or to big economies, many exporters of manufacturing goods use pricing to market. But exporting to a small economy or developing economies, it's the practice of pricing to market, I think, less prevalent as we observe in developed economies. So I think we still need to pay attention on the impacts of exchange rate and global supply and demand on the domestic inflation. To conclude, all in all, I can say that this book helps better understand inflation, what inflation is, what drives inflation, what it means for investor and consumer, even with very limited knowledge of economics. And I really enjoy reading this book. I stop here and thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Bapak Sahminan, for such a comprehensive review. And maybe to summarize your review, you stated that this inflation is a problem not only for emerging countries, but also the developed countries. You also said that the book will help us to understand inflation, provide excellent information about inflation, and this book has different approach than usual explanation, especially the classroom explanation of inflation. And you said that in this book, Paul also stated that we have to keep in mind increased price of commodities doesn't always mean an inflation. And also Paul explained this concept easy to understand even to people who don't really study economics. You also mentioned that this book also delivered the meaning of high inflation to consumers and investors without using econometrics, this or that. Paul explained very well what drives inflation. And you also mention the historical approach on this book that really opened our eyes what causing inflation over decades. And you conclude with saying that you're really enjoying read this book. Thank you very much, Bapak Sahminan, for your review for the book. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu, selanjutnya kita akan langsung, we will continue our session to the presentation of the author of the book, The Truth of the Inflation. Please welcome Mr. Paul Donovan with applause. But before that, let me read out a brief introduction of Mr. Paul Donovan. Paul is the Chief Economist of UBS Global Wealth Management. He is a member of the Global Investment Committee. And despite being told to stop studying art at the age of 12, he sits on the UBS Art Board. So despite of his passion in economics, he also has sense of artistry. He is a UBS opinion leader and a member of UBS Pride. He participates in the UBS Noble Perspective Program and is a supporter of the UBS Women in Economics program. Paul has an MA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford University. He is an honorary fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford, sitting on its investment committee and development board, and is a member of the Vice Chancellor Circle of Oxford. Please welcome Mr. Paul Donovan. Hello, Paul. How are you?
I'm very well, Aldi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time with us today. Paul, so before you start your presentation about your book, maybe I would like to give you the opportunity to respond to the book review by Prof. Insukirndo and Prof. Sahminan. How about the review that they just presented?
Well, first, I'd like to thank the OJK Institute for allowing me to speak on this topic. I think it is an extremely important topic and going to be very increasingly important in the years ahead. I'd like to thank Professor Insukirndo and Dr. Sahminan for their very generous reviews, for taking the time to review my book. I think that they both understood the book very well and what I was trying to communicate, which is really to try and improve everyone's understanding of inflation. I'm a very firm believer that everybody can understand economics because we all make economic decisions all of the time. The problem is economists, I think, are too enthusiastic about jargon and technical language and equations. And what I hope to try and do is to explain things in everyday language, which I think both of the reviewers picked up on, in order to help people understand the economic issues that matter in their lives. So I'm very, very grateful to the two reviewers for their very kind comments, for taking the time to review my work.
All right. On this book, you also write about the historical phase of the inflation. You know, from phase to phase, from era to era. On the writing the books, which era that is your favorite?
That's an interesting one. I mean, there are so many different episodes which are fascinating, though very often you can be quite traumatic. I really enjoyed going right back in history. We can go back 3,000–4,000 years and discover evidence of inflation in the city of Babylon in the Mediterranean, or the inflation in the later Roman Empire. And I had a lot of fun with the early experiments with paper money in 10th to 15th century China, which was also very interesting. So each period has got something very, very interesting to look at. Yeah. My own experience, of course, growing up in the 1970s, when the UK suffered very high inflation and almost got to hyperinflation, that I think has shaped a lot of my beliefs around inflation over the past few years.
All right, so we really want to hear from you about your presentation, about your book, The Truth About Inflation, and how it is related to the current situation. So Paul, please, over to you.
Well, thank you very much again. So what I'd like to do is to go through some of the key issues identified in the book, and then to try and look at what we're experiencing today in the context of those issues. I think as both the reviewers have identified, the most important thing to remember is that inflation is not one number. It's a complicated issue, and inflation means very different things to different people, to different businesses. And this fact was actually very important in motivating me to write this book. As you heard in the introduction, I sit as a member of the investment committee of St Anne's College, which is part of Oxford University. And we invest an endowment to help finance the college. And the college is sort of a mix. It's obviously an educational center, but it is a business. You know, we employ lots of people, and it is an investor. We have to invest money for the future. And as I was sitting on the investment committee, it became very, very obvious that the inflation that we talk about in the UK economy, the consumer price inflation number, for example, wasn't very relevant to the college's inflation rate, because the college spends most of its money on professors and other academics and buildings. That is where we spend our money. So the price of a car going up or down, we don't care. You know, the price of clothing going up or down, we don't care. We care about wages, and we care about building maintenance and building costs. And so it became very obvious to me on the investment committee that the college had to have a different idea about inflation if it was going to manage its risks and its policies and its investments in an appropriate way. So inflation is not one single number. Inflation is much more complicated than that, and we have to think very broadly about how inflation is going to be relevant to us as business owners and as investors. So let us start then with the definition. What is inflation? So the broad definition, we've already discussed this, is that it is a general change in prices. Inflation is when a large number of prices in an economy are increasing, that's inflation, or are decreasing, which is deflation, but it has to be a broad range of prices. Individual prices will change all the time because supply and demand for individual products will change all the time. So in recent years, for example, the price of compact discs has been coming down. And that is simply because nobody buys compact discs anymore. We all stream or download our music. But that doesn't mean we have deflation in the economy, because the price of compact discs goes down, the cost of subscribing to Spotify goes up. You have relative price changes. That's telling me about supply and demand of compact discs, supply and demand for Spotify. It is not telling me about the economy at large. We cannot stop prices adjusting, nor should we try to, because fashion changes, consumer spending patterns change, and so relative prices will always change. But if we have a situation where prices across a wide range of goods and services are rising, what that tells me is that the broad nature of price change is signaling that there is an imbalance in the economy. And if there is an imbalance in the economy, that means that policymakers need to pay attention. And so inflation is signaling that something is wrong with the wider economy. Maybe there is a credit bubble or there is a demand surge, but there is some imbalance in the wider economy that policymakers need to look at. It is also very important to recognize the wide range of inflation numbers that exist. It is not just consumer price inflation. And different people will need to look at different inflation numbers. As a consumer, I might want to look at consumer price inflation because that tries to approximate changes in my cost of living. But if I am looking to buy equities and I'm interested in whether there is corporate pricing power, can companies raise prices? Consumer price inflation is the wrong measure because most companies do not sell to consumers. Most companies sell to other companies. And that means that producer price inflation is a better measure of corporate pricing power than consumer price inflation is, at least for most companies. If I am a saver, I will be interested probably in consumer price inflation because I am not spending money now, but I will hope to spend money in the future. That's why we save, to spend money in the future. So I am interested in the spending power of my money in the future. And so consumer price inflation is the most important measure. But if I am a borrower, I have spent money now. So I don't care about the spending power of my money in the future. I borrow money to buy now. If I have borrowed money to buy a new car, I don't really care if the price of cars then goes up, because I bought my car today with borrowed money. What I care about is, can I afford to repay the debt? So the inflation rate that matters for borrowers is not consumer price inflation, it is income inflation. Is my income going up? Is it easier to repay the debt? Or is my income going down, making it more difficult to repay the debt? So you can see here that already we have to think about different things. Consumers and savers look at consumer price inflation. But for equity investment, producer price inflation is a better measure. For borrowers, if we think about the real cost of borrowing, we need to think about income growth. So it's a complex picture. Inflation is, of course, a major political and economic concern. As we heard in the opening remarks, inflation can cause many problems. We've had food riots over prices of food in Germany as recently as 1918. In 1971, US President Nixon was obsessed with the price of hamburger meat because this was something he thought could stop his re-election. And as a result, in 1971, wages and prices in the United States were controlled by the US government. Companies couldn't raise prices. The US government alone had the authority to put prices up. More recently, we saw inflation and falling living standards contributing to the violence of the Arab Spring movement. So inflation is not something we can ignore. It is something that matters very significantly to people's lives and to politics and political outcomes. I would argue that we should consider two particular forms of behavioral economics when we are thinking about inflation, because these are things which help explain consumers' reaction, it helps to explain investors' reaction, and it helps to explain why we so often get inflation wrong. The first issue is what we call loss aversion. Now, loss aversion is simply the fact that human beings are programmed to dislike losing something more than we like getting something. So a loss is more serious than a gain. It is a survival mechanism. We run away from the tiger 3 times more quickly than we run towards food, for example. So what that means is people react more strongly to a loss. And of course, inflation is something which causes us to lose. We lose spending power. So people are very, very negative about inflation when it is high, and they're more likely to forget about inflation when it is low, because we are programmed to remember the bad things, not the good things. And so that does mean that rising inflation creates a very strong reaction from consumers and from investors. Secondly, we have an issue called frequency bias. We remember the things that we buy frequently. We forget the things that we buy every 3 years or every 5 years. So, for example, I know that if the price of a chocolate bar in the work vending machine here in London goes from 50 pence to 60 pence, so a 20% increase, I am going to have colleagues come up and tell me inflation is out of control, I'm now paying 20% more for my Snickers chocolate bar. Now, my colleagues can only eat so many bars of chocolate every day. It is not a major part of their consumer budget, but every single time you buy a chocolate bar, you are reminded that the price has gone up by 20%. And that, of course, stays in your mind. You forget that the television set you bought 3 years earlier was 20% cheaper in price. You remember that the chocolate bar has gone up 20% in price. This means that people tend to focus on food, on fuel, on transport costs as being the main drivers of inflation, and they forget about healthcare or education or some housing costs or consumer durable goods, and they don't focus on those. That means that we tend to have a very distorted view of inflation as consumers and as investors, because our instinct is to remember price increases, forget price declines, remember the high frequency purchases, forget the other purchases. So we don't have a terribly rational view of inflation. When we get significant inflation episodes, they do tend to stay with us as stories, as memories. And this is something we've seen throughout history. Now, I've mentioned we have evidence of inflation for over 4,000 years. The Romans, the Greeks, the ancient Chinese civilizations all have lots of evidence of inflation. For us, in modern times, I think we have two particular areas where history still influences us today. As I said, I grew up in the 1970s, and the high inflation of the 1970s has become what Professor Robert Shiller calls a dominant narrative. We know the story of 1970s inflation. We think we know the story of 1970s inflation, the oil price shocks, the trade union movements, and the resulting inflation. And that story is remembered or misremembered, badly remembered. And it shapes our belief about inflation today, particularly as we are seeing higher oil prices again. A lot of people look back to the 1970s or remember the 1970s and try and draw parallels. This is very different from the 1970s, but that was such a shocking experience to live through that it has become part of our memory about what inflation is. When we have very dramatic inflation, hyperinflation, that is something which doesn't just affect the people who live through it. it affects their children and their grandchildren, because the story is told of the disaster that hyperinflation can produce. So, as you are all no doubt aware, in Germany, there is very, very strong opposition to anything that might create inflation, because in 1923 and again in 1946, Germany had devastating hyperinflation episodes. And those are periods that people remember, they tell their children, they tell their grandchildren, and it has strongly shaped the culture. Singapore has a very strong aversion to inflation generally, because a number of Singapore citizens came from nationalist China after 1945, and nationalist China had experienced a hyperinflation, and that memory has come with them. So history can influence the inflation beliefs, the inflation concerns that we all experience. So inflation is a complicated issue. It is something that we misunderstand because of loss aversion and frequency bias. And it is something which can live with us for several generations. The experience of inflation can shape a culture over many, many years. What then goes into inflation? What is it that makes up inflation? The first thing I think to say is that asset prices have no place in inflation. We should not include asset prices in inflation at all. And if you think about it, this is very logical. Inflation reduces our future standard of living. It reduces our spending power. So when we think about inflation, we are thinking about something which reduces our ability to consume in the future. But a rise in asset prices gives us more wealth, and that increases our ability to spend in the future. So asset price inflation is the reverse of consumer price inflation. And if we include asset prices in our inflation calculations, we're going to be increasing and reducing living standards at the same time. It is too complicated. I think that asset price changes should be something we look at as economists, and of course, it is something that central banks pay attention to, quite rightly, because asset price moves can tell us something about the economy. You know, is there a credit bubble? Is there a fear of recession? Asset prices are useful indicators, but they should not be part of the inflation measure. Of course, the big problem with that is that some things are both assets and part of our standard of living. The obvious example here is housing. Excuse me. Housing is both an asset and something that contributes to our standard of living. And so what we need to try and do is separate housing as an asset from having somewhere to live. This is something that is very difficult to do, and frankly, no consumer price inflation measure has a perfect solution to this. We just need to be aware that there are problems around measuring the cost of having somewhere to live versus house prices, and these things can differ over time. When we are looking at breaking down inflation, I tend to think of inflation as being one of three separate components. We have labor costs, we have raw material prices, and we have profit margins. There are lots of ways we can break down the drivers of inflation, but this is, I think, the most useful way of thinking about it. Labor costs are typically, in a developed economy, about 70% of inflation. They are the single most important part of the inflation basket. Commodity prices in a developed economy are typically around 15, maybe 20% of inflation, and the remainder is due to profits and profit margins. In this situation, we focus, therefore, over the long term on the labor cost. Now, I think it is very important here to focus not on wages, but on labor costs, and there is an important difference here. As I repeatedly remind my boss, if you pay an economist more money because they are working harder, this is not inflationary. This is a good thing. And what we have at the moment is a situation where around the world we are increasing wages, but people are also working harder. And the labor cost, which is normally referred to as the unit labor cost, is not driving inflation. To give one example, in the United States, between 2019 and 2021, the wages of a restaurant worker rose by about 11%. Now, that's a large wage increase in the United States over 2 years. The number of restaurant workers, however, has fallen by 4%. And the output of restaurant sales have risen by 34%. So you pay 11% more to 4% fewer people who are producing 34% more output. The labor cost is therefore disinflationary, pushing inflation down rather than pushing inflation up. Commodity prices do not have a very high weight in inflation, as I said, 15 or 20%, but commodity prices can move a lot. You can have a 100%, a 200% increase in commodity prices. So wage costs are not normally big moves, but they are very important. Commodities are less important, but they have very big moves. So commodities tend to add volatility to inflation, but the long-term issue is normally around wage costs. And when we think about inflation over the longer term, it is wage costs that we have to focus on. What about printing money? Because I think one of the great myths of modern economics is the idea that printing money, it creates inflation. Now, as mentioned by Dr. Sahminan, this is not actually true. Printing too much money creates inflation, and we have to understand what has happened with money demand. If money supply goes up, but money demand also goes up, you don't have inflation. And we can see this right back to the very beginning of money printing. If you look at the Southern Sung dynasty of China in the 12th century, they were one of the first governments to print money on paper. And this was a great innovation. People liked paper money. It was more convenient. So demand for paper money kept rising. And the Sung dynasty printed more and more money. So money supply went up, but money demand also went up. And there was no inflation. But then things went wrong. And the Sung dynasty started printing more and more money, and money demand went up more slowly. Money supply grew faster than money demand, and we ended up with hyperinflation, and eventually the Sung dynasty collapsed. This is, I think, very relevant in the modern world. If we look at what has happened in the last 2 years, during the pandemic, there was a very significant increase in money demand in the global economy, because people were saving money, and they were generally saving that as cash. In the United Kingdom today, cash is used for savings more than it is used for purchases of goods and services. We use cash as a store of saving more than we use it for transactions in the economy. So that increase in demand for cash was then met by an increase in supply by central banks printing money. What is now happening is that demand for cash is coming down. People are spending their savings, which I will come on to in a moment. And so central banks are now starting to reduce the money supply by quantitative policy tightening, because as demand for cash has come down, supply of cash has come down. This need to balance demand for money with supply of money is one of the reasons why crypto, like Bitcoin, will never be a currency, in my view, and why something like Bitcoin has repeated episodes of hyperinflation. The fatal flaw of crypto is that the supply can go up, but it cannot go down. You cannot reduce the supply of Bitcoin. We can reduce the supply of dollars or sterling or rupiah. We cannot reduce the supply of crypto. The result is that when demand for crypto goes down, as it has done, the value, the spending power, if you like, completely collapses in a hyperinflation episode, which is what we are currently experiencing in the crypto market. So when we are talking about money supply and money demand, it is important to get the balance. And that means that we must be able to reduce money supply in order to balance any possible reduction in money demand. This is why when central banks own government bonds, they should not be able to cancel the government debt. Because if a central bank says, well, we own the bonds, let's just tear them up, let's forget about the debt, then you have permanently increased the money supply. And that means that you cannot sell the bonds to reduce the money supply in the future. And that means if money demand comes down in the future, you would face an inflation episode. So it's one of the reasons why you cannot cancel debt. So inflation, I think, is driven over the longer term mainly by labor costs, which is not wages, but wages adjusted for productivity. In the short term, the volatility of commodity prices can drive the volatility of inflation, and that is certainly a risk that we face. Printing money is not of itself a source of inflation. It is necessary to balance supply and demand. And if you cannot balance supply and demand, as with crypto, you run the risk of significant inflation or indeed even hyperinflation. So finally, I'd like to come on to some of the issues that we commonly hear about inflation. A lot of consumers, a lot of investors don't trust inflation data. They say it's not true. And some of this is a wrong argument. Some of this is actually a correct argument. With loss aversion, with frequency bias that I've already mentioned, people often think inflation is higher than it is. You remember the price increase, you forget the price decline, you remember the price of your chocolate bar, you forget the price of the television. And that can give you a false impression of inflation. There is also criticism of quality adjustment and hedonic adjustment, where prices are adjusted for changes in the quality of the product. So if your computer is twice as fast, it can do twice as many things, and the price hasn't changed in rupiah terms, well, you're getting twice as much computer for your money. So really, that should be classed as a price decline. I think what a lot of people fail to recognize is that quality adjustment goes both ways. If something becomes lower quality over time, that will raise inflation. And this does happen. As you get declines in quality, the statisticians will say, well, you're paying the same price for something that is poorer quality. That's really a price increase. We've seen that, for example, with restaurant meals in the past. If you get less in your restaurant meal, the price is calculated as an increase, even if the rupiah amount you spend doesn't actually change. A related issue is around shrinkflation, as it is called. Shrinkflation is when your chocolate bar does not change in price, but the chocolate bar becomes 20% smaller. So your price is unchanged, but you're buying 20% less. And some people think that this is a way of hiding inflation. This is not being hidden. The statisticians take into account the 20% reduction in size, and it will count as a 20% price increase. So that's not a genuine problem. Finally, some people complain that the composition of the inflation basket is changing, that we see different items coming in, different items going out. But again, that is supposed to happen. The inflation basket is trying to measure what it costs to live in an economy. Now, I don't care about the price of a compact disc because I haven't bought a compact disc in 15 years. So I don't think compact discs should still be in my inflation basket. But 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was buying a lot of compact discs. I was younger, I enjoyed music, and I bought my music on compact discs. So then the price of the compact disc did matter. We changed the composition of the inflation basket to reflect what is happening in the economy today. So overall, I think inflation measures generally do a reasonable job. We tend to overestimate inflation because of the loss aversion and the frequency bias, but we should be adjusting inflation for quality. We do adjust inflation for changes in size, and we do adjust inflation for changes in consumer spending. And all of those things are completely appropriate to do. But there are problems with inflation. And for me, the biggest problem is inflation inequality. Inflation is what we call a plutocratic statistic, not a demographic statistic. Plutocratic means that it is $1, 1 rupiah, £1 1 vote, not one person, one vote. Because the inflation basket uses average spending patterns, if you earn more money, you spend more money. If you spend more money, you have more influence over what goes in to the inflation basket. And in the United States today, inflation does not represent the average spending pattern of someone in the 50th percentile of income distribution. It represents the spending pattern of somebody in the 70 to 75th percentiles of income distribution. And that is a problem, because as income inequality has grown, the spending pattern of a low-income person gets further and further away from average consumer price inflation. It's not just about the composition of the goods in the basket. Do we have a higher weighting for food or a higher weighting for consumer electronics? It's also about the types of goods that you buy. If you are higher income, you will buy branded products. If you are lower income, you will buy cheaper products. If you are higher income, you can buy in bulk, which is normally cheaper. Just this morning, I was buying breakfast cereal in the local supermarket. A 1 kilogram box of cornflakes is a lot cheaper than a 500 gram box of cornflakes. If you are high income, you can afford to buy the 1 kilogram box, and that is cheaper for you. If you are lower income, you may only be able to afford the smaller box, and therefore you're paying a higher price per serving of cornflakes. All of this is creating problems with inflation inequality. And this, I think, is going to be increasing in the coming years. We have a bigger problem with inflation inequality. Income inequality has grown in recent years. We are seeing food and energy prices increasing. That tends to be what low-income people spend most money on, and therefore the divergence of the inflation experience is growing. So when we look at inflation, we cannot just think about inflation as a single, simple number. It is more complex than that. We have inflation driven largely by labor costs over time, but where we can get short-term distortions coming through from issues around commodity prices, supply-demand imbalances, and so on. We are in a situation where inflation generally does what it is supposed to do, and it adjusts for quality and for size, but where the different spending patterns of different income groups are becoming a more significant problem. To put it very simply, the lower income people face a higher inflation rate. Older people, because of healthcare costs, face a higher inflation rate. So if you want low inflation, you need to be young and rich if you can possibly manage it. What then does all of this mean when we look at the inflation episode we have today. The inflation today is a very, very unusual pattern of inflation. Labor costs have not been behind the US inflation or the European inflation. Labor costs have played a far, far smaller role in recent inflation than they have done over the last 20 years. And if you think about it, real wages, wages adjusted for inflation, are negative in nearly all major economies today. What we have had, however, is an increase in pricing power because of a significant increase in demand in the aftermath of the pandemic. What we saw in developed markets during the pandemic was people still had income, but they were not able to spend money. You couldn't go on holiday. You couldn't go to a restaurant. You stayed at home and could not spend. The result was a significant increase in savings in the major economies of the world. As restrictions started to lift, consumers rushed out to spend the money they had saved during the pandemic. And because people were still nervous about travel, nervous about going to crowded restaurants or theaters, people spent on goods rather than services. This led to an extraordinary increase in demand for goods. In the United States, in 2021, the increase in demand for goods was the strongest we have seen since 1946. This was the biggest surge in demand for goods in 75 years. In 1946, President Truman ended wartime rationing, and people rushed out to spend the money they'd saved in wartime. In 2021, roughly the same thing happened. Now, global supply of goods hit an all-time record high last year. Global manufacturing output, all-time record high. Global trade as a share of the economy, all-time record high. But the increase in demand was so unusual, it was stronger than the increase in supply. And when demand is greater than supply, we tend to see inflation come through. That is what has driven the inflation story over the course of last year. It has mainly been about goods. But then, of course, we have added a war in Europe, the war in Ukraine, which has increased energy costs in addition, and that has further added to inflation. So we have had an extraordinary increase in demand, but we have also then had a relative price shock of rising energy. Now, as we look ahead, I think inflation is likely to decline over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. And this is because that extraordinary demand for goods is already coming down. We are starting to see a decline in demand for goods. Why is this? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, because the savings we had in the pandemic have been spent. Low-income US households have already spent their savings. There is no more money left to spend from savings. And so that is reducing demand. And secondly, because people have bought what they wanted to buy. If you bought a new washing machine in 2021, You're not going to buy another washing machine in 2022. It's not like an Apple iPhone. You don't rush out to buy the latest new model of washing machine every time there is an upgrade. So the demand is naturally coming down. And we can already see this. So last year, if we look at the price of televisions, there was a huge increase in television prices. Everyone was buying televisions. Everyone wanted a new TV. They got money to spend. They rushed out. They bought a new TV. In the United States, televisions were rising over 11% a year in price. But now you don't have any savings. The television you've got is perfectly good. You don't need a new television. Now demand has come down. And television prices in the States are falling by 5.6% year over year. We've gone from 11% up to 5.6% down as demand has come down. So I think that this process will help to reduce inflation over the course of the next few months. The higher energy costs, some increase in service costs, means that inflation will not get to pre-pandemic levels. But as a very rough indication, I would expect in developed economies, inflation at the end of this year will be about half what it is today, as we see demand coming down to normal and the inflation rate coming down to normal. Finally, to conclude, as I'm already over time, three issues that I wanted to mention in the longer term around inflation, which I think are important to consider. The first is whether environmental sustainability will create higher inflation. Do we get what is called greenflation? And the answer, I think, as so often in economics, is yes and no. In the short term, the move to environmental sustainability will increase costs because we will have to pay to install solar panels or to become more efficient. But the aim over the longer term is to increase energy efficiency, and that will reduce our costs of energy over time. So when I installed solar panels on my house, because even in the UK, solar panels do work, that cost me a lot of money to install the solar panels. But since then, I haven't had to pay for electricity because I generate enough electricity to run my home using solar panels. So the sustainability creates a short-term cost increase, but longer term, I think, is less inflationary. Second, will the reversal of globalization create inflation? I think this depends on why globalization is reversing. And I think that globalization will go into decline. If you have a decline in trade because of trade tariffs, because of sanctions, because of war, that creates less efficiency, and that will push up inflation. However, if you see companies choosing to use new technology to locate closer to their customers because it is more efficient to do so, that will reduce inflation over time. Again, to come back to the example of music, as we have gone from compact discs to streaming, trade has collapsed. A compact disc took 5 or 6 different countries to make it. Now we've lost all of that trade and we simply buy in a service, streaming, from one country. But that has also significantly reduced the cost of entertainment because we are more efficient when we stream than when we go out and buy a compact disc. Finally, will technology, will shopping online and so on improve price transparency and lower inflation? Here, I think the answer is probably no. And the reason for that is that although in theory, we can go online in the internet and compare prices and go to the lowest cost provider at all times, the reality is that we tend not to do that. And the book, The Truth About Inflation, is a very good example of this. When the book was published, the price was £25 sterling. So at today's exchange rate, that's about 460,000 rupiah. Absolute bargain, ideal gift. Amazon, however, made a mistake. Amazon did not price my book at £25. Amazon priced my book at £150. So 6 times the price. Every other bookseller online sold my book at £25, but Amazon sold it for 150. Anyone who wanted to buy the book just had to search on Google and they would find hundreds of booksellers with the £25 price and Amazon with 150. It took 1 month for Amazon to correct its price. I still managed to sell enough copies on Amazon that it made it to the economic bestseller lists because people didn't compare price. So I think technology can do a lot around inflation in the future, but we should remember that not everybody compares prices in the way that economic theory says they're supposed to. Thank you very much for your attention. Aldi, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very, valuable lesson learned from you about inflation. That is really interesting how you elaborate the, inflations with the closest approach of our livelihood. And yeah, if I have to may summarize what's your explanation, that was very eye-opening to all of us. And you stated that this inflation consists of a large number of economic and different people need to look at different inflation numbers. Depends if you are a customers, equity investors, company, savers, or borrowers. There are different ways of seeing inflation, right? And you also stated that this inflation is major political and economic concerns. Inflation is not something we can ignore. It is really relevant to people's lives and also political. And what is really interesting about your presentation was the frequency bias that you explained to us, that people tend to have very distorted views of inflation, that inflation is complicated issues that often misunderstood because of this frequency bias. And from your presentation, we also found that you said why assets price shouldn't be included to define inflations. Inflation reduce future standards of living, reduce our ability to consume in the future, while the rise in asset price increase the ability to buy in the future. So if we include asset price, they are going to be increasing and reducing living standard in future. Inflation today is really unusual. And you also stated that the inflation that happening around the world now is really unusual pattern of inflation. Paul, you really present a critical issue for the government as a policymakers and also for businesses, especially on making the businesses decision. We learned much from you today, and it is a great touch about the truth of inflation. Please give applause for Paul Donovan, the author of the book, The Truth of the Inflation. Thank you very much, Paul. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu, we have come to our question and answer session. We see that there are a lot of questions that are coming up. And I would like to remind you again, if you have a question towards our discussion, you might type your question via Q&A features by mentioning your name, institution, and the name of the speaker to whom you deliver your question to. And also, your question can be submitted in English or Bahasa because we have the interpreter features on our Zoom meeting room. All right, so we've already have 4 questions. I'll be glad to read the first question from Rian Kiryanto. This question addressed to all of the speakers. So the question is, now the world is facing what we call stagflation due to increasing of commodities price and disruption of global supply chains. In addition, war crisis in Russia versus Ukraine also add more seriously the gloomy situation. How's your idea about the global stagflations towards the prospect of Indonesian economic? Thank you very much. That was the question for all of the speakers. Maybe I will give the opportunity to answer first to Mr. Insukindro. Prof, you may answer the question first. Professor Insukindro, are you with us? Yeah? You're still on the mute? Yeah, please, Prof. The stagflation.
Ini untuk Pak Rian ya, saya pakai bahasa aja ya.
Ya, silakan Prof. Ada interpreter.
Ringkasnya begini Pak Rian, stagflasi itu inflasi yang tinggi dan resesi. Jadi kalau inflasinya seperti tadi dikatakan itu naik, maka kita lihat resesinya. Nah, selama krisis ini kita resesi.
Look at the recession during the crisis, the pandemic, we have experienced recession.
Sehingga kita ngalami dua itu, stagflasi karena inflasi yang tinggi dan resesi bersama-sama. Dan ini kalau pakai teori makro yang baru mudah dijelaskan Pak Rian. Jadi itu ada di posisi kita sekarang itu pada posisi resesi dari makro baru. Jadi pada resesi dan harga-harga naik. Sekarang misalnya seperti yang tadi dikatakan oleh Pak Paul ya, bahwa karena permintaan itu meningkat dan itu mendorong inflasi di situ. Nah, karena mendorong inflasi, tetapi ekonominya belum kembali pulih, belum. Jadi kita masih mengalami gejala itu. Nah, dan seperti yang diperkirakan Pak Paul tadi, 6 sampai 12 bulan itu inflasinya turun. Seperti itu kira-kira jawabannya singkatnya.
Alright, thank you very much, Prof, for your answers.
Terima kasih banyak Bapak Profesor atas jawaban Bapak. Mungkin pada Bapak Sahminan, persilakan mungkin bisa menanggapi.
Maybe.
Thank you, Pak Ali, and thank you for the questions, Pak Rian. I think that based on the data that we have, global economy is not in stagflation yet. True that the global economy, there's an increase in inflation, but there is lower than expected economic growth, but there's still the economy is still growing since after the peak of the COVID. Say if we look at the latest publication of the IMF, you can see that the global economy is still growing. But now the question maybe is that what is the implications of the lower than expected global economy and the Indonesian economy. Well, that one is for sure, yeah, as a small open economy, that our economy cannot be isolated from what's going on in the global economy. To what extent, of course, we have different, many kind of estimations for that. We can use just simple elasticity, and also we can use more sophisticated models to estimate what is the impacts of lower global economic growth into Indonesian economy. So overall, I can say that the recovery from the crisis during the peak of the COVID in 2020 is still going on. It's just that the recovery is not as strong as what we expected before. That's my thought on this, Pak Aldi. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Prof. Sahminan. So far we could still manage the momentum of the economic growth despite of the global uncertainties mentioned from Pak Rian, as a crisis in Russia versus Ukraine, and also stagflation. Paul, you may have some more points towards the questions.
Well, I think from the global perspective, the one thing I would say is when stagflation occurs, and it is a very, very rare event, the pricing mechanism is breaking down, because you're saying, well, demand is going down, but prices are going up. And that, of course, is not what is supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. When I look at the detail of inflation, as I mentioned in my presentation, globally today, where demand goes down, prices are coming down. When we look at those areas of goods demand, where demand is slowing down, we are seeing either lower inflation or negative inflation, outright deflation is taking place. And so that doesn't suggest to me that we are in a stagflation environment, at least not in the global economy. Mm-hmm. As I look at the global economy today, I am more worried about low growth than I am about high inflation. I think the inflation will come down automatically, but I think there are more risks around growth because of the war in Ukraine, because of the effects of the pandemic in China, because savings have been spent, because lower income consumers face more difficulties. The one thing I would say there is, as we discovered in the pandemic, as we discovered in Japan after Fukushima, as we discovered in the United States after 9/11, people do adapt in the face of a crisis. So I think we need to be careful about being too pessimistic on growth. But I would suggest that we don't have evidence of stagflation in the details of the data. In fact, quite the reverse. But growth is probably the bigger risk rather than inflation in the near term.
All right, I hope that's enough to answer the questions. We move on to the second questions. That is from PT Bank Sumut. Bank Sumut is one of the regional bank in Indonesia, from Ms. Riri Yasri Ivan. The question is for all the speakers. The question is, banking sector representatives are part of the province level inflation control task force, or TPID. What is the best approach for the banking sector to help achieve desired inflation rate in the subnational level, considering different internal and external inflation drives, such as the COVID-19, the Russia and Ukraine, political development, and etc. Thank you. Prof. Ins, you may answer first. Professor? All right. Yeah. Prof. Ins, do you catch up with the question? You still on the mute? Okay.
I cannot get the question, and so I cannot answer the question. I cannot get the question, and I cannot.
Yeah. So maybe I will repeat once again. The question is about the banking sector representatives are part of the province-level inflation control task force. What is the best approach for the banking sector to help achieve desired inflation rate in the sub-national level, considering different internal and external inflation drivers?
Okay. It's difficult for me to answer.
Yeah. How to catch up the subnational inflation for subnational banking level?
Because the question is about banking level.
All right, maybe Prof. Sahminan? I think you are the best panelist to answer this question.
Thank you, Pali. But if I may correct a bit, actually I'm not a professor like Professor Itsukino.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, but
soon to be.
Anyway, I think just to give also maybe our Paul doesn't really maybe this is the first time he hear about inflation controlling task force, because in Indonesia, just to give some idea on this. So in Indonesia, the fact that we know that sources of inflation frequently comes from the supply sectors. For example, due to bad weather, then distribution distribution of food commodities. So regional governments, together with central governments, creates a task force to how to deal with that. So so in this case is that I think that I just bring a bit to your book that which I totally agree with you that so in this case that the government is not trying to control the price itself, the price of the commodity, but trying to solve the issue of what's the issue that from the supply side that drives the inflation. So now the questions of a colleague from Bank Sumut is that what's the role of the banking sector? I think that here we just go back. What is what can drive inflation? So one thing is that because too much demand that cannot be met by the supply. So in this case, I think the banking sector can. One thing is that identify from the supply side, identify what needs by your customers, what needs by the consumers, say in North Sumatra, mainly that usually have constraints in the supply side. For example, that if you see that the price of chili papers increase and quite often creates one of the sources of inflation in North Sumatra because of, say, not enough supply. I think in that case is that you see that there is demand in that, so that maybe the banking sector can boost the production of chili paper in such a way that it won't become the source of inflation. Well, of course, it's not just because of the chili paper itself, but because one thing is that chili papers are consumed by a lot of people in North Sumatra. That's one thing. Another thing is that if you see that people, the consumption is or demand side, you see it's too high, while the supply is not is quite stable. That and also maybe income is not is just quite stable. Also, you see excessive credit growth. I think in that case also, well, the banking sector have started to think about that. Well, in this case, maybe we have to slow down extending credit to slow down the demand that's not met by the supply. I think that's my idea on that. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, well, it is really a collaboration from the central bank to the regional bank to the national bank. And yeah, as you mentioned that its inflation rate in North Sumatra is quite achieved the desired level. Paul, how do you think about it, the inflation level, how to approach the desired inflation rate in the subnational level?
Well, I think that there are two things that the banking system can do at a subnational level. As Dr. Sahminan was sort of talking about, the banking system has a role in providing credit. And I think it is important for the banks to be monitoring the degree of credit that they are putting into the economy. Are they helping on the supply side? Is the credit going to increase demand? Is that appropriate given the level of inflation? So that's the direct measure. But I think what is also very important, of course, is that subnational banks, all banks, have access to very good quality information. Because obviously, as a bank, your customers are businesses, are consumers. You are able to talk to them to understand what is going on in the economy. And having a way of transmitting that information to the central bank or to the government can also help make better decisions at a national level, which will also have an impact. And I think that because in all countries, we have problems with the quality of economic data, and actually growing problems with the quality of economic data and measuring what's happening in an economy in real time. The fact that banks talk to entrepreneurs and business people and consumers every day, that's a really valuable tool that they can use to help manage the overall inflation situation.
All right. Yeah. Furthermore, you can read the book, The Truth About Inflation, to get the best approach for the subnational banking cooperation. All right. We move on to the question number 3. It is actually for you, Paul. The question is, how do you see the free trade contributes towards the inflation of a country? And how do you see a country should deal with high inflation, which caused mostly by imported inflation?
So this is a good question. There is a debate about how much globalization and the increase of trade has changed inflation over the last 30 years. The story is that globalization reduced inflation, but that is a very European or American story. Because globalization reduced inflation for manufactured goods, which are quite labor intensive, because globalization lowered the cost of labor globally. But what it also did was increase the cost of commodities, relatively speaking, because, for example, if you outsource from the United States to China, you are going from a high labor cost economy to a low labor cost economy, lowers the cost of labor, but you're going from a commodity efficient consumer to a commodity inefficient consumer, and you are increasing incomes in a commodity inefficient consumer as well, and so that creates a relative price shift. So the growth of global trade has a mixed picture. It's more about relative prices than about absolute prices. As we discussed earlier on, if you are a large country, involved in global trade, generally, companies will price to market. That is to say that they will set their prices according to local market conditions, so local supply and local demand. The exception to that is commodities, because commodities are a truly global market. But for manufactured products, US car prices are totally different from UK car prices and European car prices, because car manufacturers set the price in the local market. And so free trade doesn't necessarily have a huge impact there. With smaller economies, you are more subject to import price inflation coming about. And then you have to start thinking about, well, how do you manage the import price inflation? Generally speaking, if an exporting country has rising inflation relative to yours, then the exporting country's currency should be weakening in value, and the strengthening of your currency will help offset the import price inflation. That's what theory tells us. Theory doesn't work entirely in practice, but that is one aspect. And of course, the importing country may not want the currency to strengthen, because that will affect the export sector of their own country. But if you are saying, well, the standard of living is the most important thing, and we therefore want to maintain the standard of living, you allow your currency to appreciate, reflecting the fact that the other country has higher inflation than you do, and that is an offset. If you are in a situation where commodity prices are rising, again, you can strengthen your currency to offset that. The other thing that you can try and do is increase efficiency of consumption to reduce the effect of higher commodity prices. And that is something that is happening. So we are seeing, for example, now that a number of countries are increasing fuel efficiency to offset the higher cost of oil imports. So in the UK, for example, people are a lot more likely to work from home because with the cost of diesel and petrol, gasoline so high, people are saying, well, I don't want to drive to work. If I work from home 3 days a week, I cut my fuel bill by 60%. Well, why wouldn't you do that? And so you're starting to see efficiency options coming in, though that tends to work best with commodities rather than with manufactured products.
All right, maybe the key is just like what you stated before, the how we balancing all of that aspects. All right, Paul, well, actually there are a lot of questions coming in on our discussion today. I've seen that there are 27 questions from our participants towards our discussion, but we really apologize that we cannot answer all the questions due to our limited times, Paul. And we have to inform you, all of you, that we're really proud to announce that there are more than 1,000 people joining us today in our live Zoom webinar. So thank you very much for all your participation. Please give a round of applause for today's discussion, for our author, for our book reviewer. And we have come to our closing session. It is the closing remarks. I would like to give the opportunity to Prof. Insukindro, Pak Sahminan, and also Paul Donovan to deliver their closing remarks. And we go first to Prof. Insukindro. The time is yours, please. Prof, you're still on mute. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I learned a lot from Paul, especially because this book is very different approach, especially for historical approach and also not to mathematical or economic model. I know a lot about the model, but it is interesting for me to study from your book. This is my closing remark, Pak Aldi.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Ins, for your closing remarks. And Prof. Sahminan, please.
Okay, once again, I would like to thank OJK Institute for inviting me to join this this event and to have an opportunity to review the book by Paul Donovan. Like I already said before, that I can say that this book is really very helpful to give a better understanding on inflation, even with very limited knowledge on economic concepts or economic theory. So the fact that inflations affect us as consumer or as investors. So I think reading this book will improve our understanding on inflation and what do we really need to pay attention, what kind of inflation that we need to pay attention, that if we want to invest on something for future income. Because I frankly enjoy reading that book. For those of you who have an opportunity, I recommend to read that book. That's it. Thank you. Yeah. Again, I'd like to thank Paul Donovan for that book.
Thank you very much, Pak Sahminan, for your closing statement. Yes, indeed we did. We really enjoy our discussion today, and we learned a lot from Paul. Paul, over to you for your closing remarks.
Well, I should start by thanking my two very distinguished reviewers. I'm very proud that they took time to offer such generous comments and insights to the book. And thank you, Aldi, to you for moderating the session so expertly. And of course to the Institute for hosting the event. I think what I hope people will take from today's session is to remember that inflation is a lot more complicated than just the headline inflation CPI. And you need to think a little bit about what is the relevant inflation measure for you. Are you a borrower? Are you a saver? Are you an investor? Are you a consumer? These are all different inflation rates. And I think that is going to be perhaps the most important thing to consider. And it does pay to look at the detail of inflation, to understand what is going on, and to check the facts of what is going on. Because with loss aversion and with frequency bias, inflation is one of those areas where you should not trust your instincts, not trust your emotion, but trust the analysis. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to today's seminar. And again, thanks to the Institute for organizing such a very enjoyable event.
Yeah, 1,216 participants joining our discussions today. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for your closing statements. And yes, this book really helped us to understand more about the inflation, think about beyond of the CPI numbers. And this really helped us as investors, consumers to think about what the decision we would take regarding our business decision. Thank you very much, Paul Donovan, for your closing remarks. And thank you also for Prof. Insukindro, Bapak Sahminan, for your insightful sessions and also the closing remarks. Please give applause for today's events. Thank you, OJK, for facilitating this seminar, this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to inform you that the link for the feedback form is available on the chat feature please complete the feedback form before this event ends. Yeah, participants may also access today's webinar's materials and recording at bit.ly/OJK IBB materials.
Oke, terima kasih Mas
Then we would
Adi.
like to inform you that we are really proud to announce the highest number of our joining Zoom participants for today is 1,216 participants, and the highest number of joined participants, the majority comes from the banking sector, 825 participants or 48%, the non-bank financial industry 19%, OJK 11%, academics 6%, the capital market sector 4%, and the government institution 4%, others 8%. And before we end, we would like to also inform you that OJK Institute invite you for the next webinar with the theme Preventing and Combating Financial Crime in Financial Services Industry on June 9th, 2022. We have Bapak Profesor Dr. Andes Adrianus Eliasta Sembiring Meliala, Pakar Kriminologi and Police Department, Deputi Bidang Pemberantasan PPATK, dan juga ada Bapak Agus Dwi Handaya, Direktur Compliance and Human Capital Bank Mandiri Persero as speakers. And this event will be moderated by Glory Oyong. She is presenter and corporate communication at Kompas Gramedia. And furthermore, OJK Institute is inviting you to join Call for Papers, Karisma, OJK Institute 2022. Recover Together, Recover Stronger Through Green Economy by the team building a sustainable financial green industry and sustainable Sharia financial services, atau membangun industri berbasis teknologi hijau dan penerapan sustainable financial di industri jasa keuangan. Paper submission deadline is on July 15, 2022. All right, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our book review on behalf of Indonesia Financial Services Authority, OJK. I would like to thank you for joining us today, and we are looking forward to meet you again in the next occasions. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Salam kebajikan, Om Santi Santi Om. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Terima kasih, Pak.
Terima kasih, Mas
Sahminan.
Aldi. Thank you, Mr. Paul.
Prof. Kim.
Terima kasih, Prof. Terima kasih, Pak Sahminan. Terima kasih.
Salam sehat, Pak Sahminan.
Thank you, Paul. I'll see you.
Terima kasih semuanya.
Oke, terima kasih.